The city burned against the purple sky of Kepler 442b. Smoke rose from the crystal towers that once caught sunlight and turned it into rainbow patterns across the streets. Now those same towers lay broken, their pieces scattered like shattered glass on the ground. Zaraki pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the underground tunnel. Her translucent skin glowed faintly in the darkness, a sign of the fear that ran through her people. Around her, 200 Zephyrians huddled, together in the narrow space. They were all that remained of a population that once numbered in the millions. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed from above. The Vorthons were searching again, their thick boots crushing the delicate crystal flowers that grew in the ruins. Zaraki could hear their harsh voices speaking in their guttural language, planning the next phase of their hunt. She looked at the faces around her. Elder Keith Na, whose songs had once filled the great concert halls, now whispered prayers to gods who seemed to have abandoned them. Young Veltu held her infant close to her chest, trying to keep the child quiet as tears rolled down her face. The warriors who had survived the initial attack sat with empty eyes, their weapons long since destroyed by enemy fire. 3 months ago, the Vorthons had arrived without warning. Their black ships had appeared in the sky like a storm cloud, blocking out the twin suns that gave life to their world. The first attacks had been surgical, destroying the planetary defense grid and communication arrays. Then came the bombardment. Zaraki remembered the day her world ended. She had been in the command center of the capital city, watching helplessly as enemy missiles struck the shield generators. The protective barrier that had surrounded their civilization for 1,000 years had flickered and died in minutes. After that, the real killing began. The Vorthons were not interested in conquest. They wanted extermination. Their reptilian soldiers moved through the cities methodically, destroying everything that lived. They burned the singing forests where Zephyrian children learned to communicate through telepathy. They poisoned the crystal lakes where families gathered to share memories. They crushed the art galleries that held 10,000 years of beautiful creations. Now in the darkness of the tunnels, Zaraki checked her scanner one more time. The device showed red dots moving across the surface above them. Vorthon patrol units sweeping back and forth in a grid pattern. They were closing in. She had sent 17 distress signals into space over the past month. Each one had traveled faster than light toward the core systems where other civilizations might hear their plea for help. But no one had answered. The galaxy was vast, and most species were too far away or too afraid of the Vorthons to respond. The Altarian Federation had been the first to fall to Vorthon expansion 6 years ago. The peaceful traders had tried to negotiate, offering resources and technology in exchange for their lives. The Vorthons had taken everything and then killed them anyway. After that, other races had either submitted or fled to distant systems. Child began to cry somewhere in the darkness. The sound was quickly muffled, but not before it echoed off the tunnel walls. Zaraki felt her heart sink. Sound carried in these underground passages, and the Vorthons had excellent hearing. She moved carefully through the huddled groups until she reached the communications array they had salvaged from a destroyed outpost. The quantum transmitter was their last connection to the outside universe. Its blue lights flickered weakly, powered by a failing energy cell. Elder Keth Na approached her, his ancient face lined with sorrow. He spoke in the traditional way of their people, his thoughts flowing directly into her mind through their natural telepathic link. Commander, perhaps it is time to accept our fate. We have fought bravely, but the enemy is too strong. Maybe we should use our remaining time to preserve our songs and stories for whatever archaeologists might find us in the distant future. Zaraki felt the weight of leadership crushing down on her shoulders. She was only 34 years old, by Zephyrian standards barely an adult when the war began. The older, more experienced commanders had all died in the first wave of attacks. She had been promoted by necessity, not by choice, but something inside her refused to give up. Her people had survived ice ages and meteor impacts. They had built a civilization based on art, music, and the sharing of thoughts and feelings. They had never harmed another species or sought to conquer other worlds. They deserved better than to die forgotten in these tunnels. She activated the transmitter one final time, using the last of its power to send a message toward the galactic core. Her fingers moved across the crystal interface, encoding their location, their situation, and their desperate need for help. The message was simple but heartfelt. She told whoever might be listening about her people's love of beauty and their commitment to peace. She described the Vorthan attacks and their systematic destruction of everything her civilization had built. She asked not for vengeance, but for someone to remember that they had existed. As the transmission ended, the tunnel shook. Dust fell from the ceiling as heavy footsteps approached from multiple directions. The Vorthans had found them. Zara Key gathered her people around her in the darkness. Some held hands, others shared final telepathic messages with their loved ones. The children were quiet now, sensing the fear of the adults around them. She looked up at the ceiling, knowing that death waited above. Her message was traveling through space at impossible speeds, but it would take time to reach other star systems. Even if someone received it, they would not arrive in time to save her people. But maybe, just maybe, someone would hear their story and remember that the Zephyrians had tried to bring beauty to a universe that seemed to worship only destruction. The Gion. Footsteps stopped directly overhead. Zaraki heard the whine of energy weapons charging up. She closed her eyes and prepared for the end, hoping that death would come quickly for the children. Above them, General Krex Vor smiled with satisfaction as his soldiers prepared to finish their work. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Dakota, watching the stars stream past through the main viewing screen. His ship was heading home after 3 months of successful negotiations with the Altarian trade colonies. The mission had gone better than expected, and his crew was looking forward to shore leave on Earth. The Dakota was not the largest ship in the human fleet, but it was fast and well-armed. Morrison had commanded her for 5 years, and his crew, of 800, trusted him completely. They had fought pirates together, explored unknown systems, and established first contact with peaceful alien species. Lieutenant Amy Foster looked up from her communications console with a puzzled expression. She was young but skilled, having graduated at the top of her class from the Naval Academy. Her fingers moved quickly across the controls as she tried to make sense of what she was receiving. "Captain, I'm picking up something strange," she said. "It's a distress signal, but it's not coming from any human ship. The language is completely unknown, and the transmission method is unlike anything in our databases." Morrison walked over to her station. The bridge was quiet except for the usual hum of the ship's engines and the soft beeping of various instruments. His crew worked efficiently around him, monitoring their course home. "Can you translate it?" he asked. Amy shook her head. "The computer is trying, but it's going to take time. The signal is very weak, like it traveled a long distance. And Captain, there's something else. The transmission contains what looks like astronomical data. Star positions, planetary information, that kind of thing." Commander Lisa Beck, Morrison's second-in-command, joined them at the communications station. She was a veteran officer who had served with Morrison since his first command. Her experience had saved their lives more than once during dangerous missions. "Where did the signal come from?" she asked. Amy checked her readings. "The Kepler system, about 40 light-years from here. But Captain, according to our charts, that area is in the middle of what intelligence calls Vorthan space." Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. The Vorthans were bad news. Human ships had encountered them twice in the past 10 years, and both meetings had ended badly. The reptilian aliens were aggressive and seemed to have no interest in peaceful contact. They had destroyed human exploration vessels without provocation and then disappeared back into their own territory. "Keep working on the translation," Morrison ordered. "I want to know what that message says." 2 hours later, Amy called him back to the bridge. Her face was pale and her hands shook slightly as she handed him a data tablet with the translated message. Morrison read it twice before he fully understood what he was seeing. The signal came from a species called the Zephyrians, who lived on a planet called Kepler 442b. They were under attack by the Vorthans and facing complete destruction. The message was their final plea for help, sent to anyone in the galaxy who might be listening. "How old is this transmission?" Morrison asked. 3 days, sir," Amy replied. It's been traveling through space for 3 days. If the situation was desperate when they sent it, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Morrison understood. By now, the Zephyrians might already be dead. He called his senior officers to the conference room. The space was small but comfortable, with a large table surrounded by chairs. The walls displayed star charts and tactical information about their current mission. Commander Beck sat across from him, studying the translated message on her own tablet. Lieutenant Commander Nick Johnson, the ship's tactical officer, reviewed what little information they had about Vorthan military capabilities. Dr. Helen Wright, the chief medical officer, read the parts of the message that described Zephyrian biology and culture. What do we know about this species? Morrison asked. Dr. Wright looked up from her tablet. According to the message, they're humanoid, but with some significant differences. They have translucent skin and natural telepathic abilities. They seem to be peaceful, focused on art and music rather than warfare. The message describes a civilization that has never engaged in aggressive expansion or conquest, and the Vorthans are killing them, Johnson said grimly. The message describes systematic extermination, not conquest. They're not interested in enslaving the Zephyrians or taking their resources. They just want them dead. Morrison thought about his grandfather, who had fought in Earth's Third World War. The old man had told him stories about the importance of standing up to bullies even when the odds seemed impossible. He had also taught Morrison about humanity's responsibility to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. What are our orders regarding situations like this? Morrison asked Beck. Our official mission is exploration and trade, she replied. But our general orders do include provisions for rendering aid to sentient species under threat from aggressive forces. The question is whether we're capable of making a difference. Johnson pulled up tactical displays on the room's main screen. Sir, if the Vorthans are conducting a planetary assault, they probably have multiple ships in the system. We're just one cruiser. We might be fast and well-armed by human standards, but we don't know how we compare to their technology. Dr. Wright leaned forward. But we do know they're committing genocide. These Zephyrians are obviously peaceful people who never did anything to deserve this. If we don't try to help them, who will? Morrison stood up and walked to the viewing port. Space stretched out endlessly before them, filled with billions of stars and countless worlds. Most of those worlds were empty, but some held life, and some of that life was crying out for help while facing extinction. He thought about Earth's history, about all the times when good people had stood by and done nothing while evil triumphed. He also thought about the times when ordinary people had chosen to act even when success seemed impossible. Amy, he said, turning back to his officers, send a message to Fleet Command. Tell them we're responding to an alien distress call and may be entering hostile territory. Give them our planned route and estimated arrival time. Sir, Beck said carefully, are you sure about this? We don't know what we're flying into. The Zephyrians might already be dead. We could be walking into a trap. Morrison looked at each of his officers in turn. These were good people who had followed him through dangerous situations before. He had no right to ask them to risk their lives for strangers they had never met. I'm going to put it to the crew, he said finally. Everyone gets to vote. If we're going to do this, we do it, together. If anyone wants to be transferred to another ship when we reach the next starbase, I'll understand completely. 3 hours later, the results were in. Out of 800 crew members, 796 had voted to respond to the distress call. The 4 who voted against it asked to stay aboard anyway, saying they trusted their captain's judgment. Morrison gave the order to change course. The USS Dakota turned away from Earth and toward the Kepler system, racing through space at maximum speed. In the engine room, Bobby Martinez and his team worked around the clock to squeeze every bit of performance from their quantum drive systems. Dr. Wright began preparing medical supplies for alien physiology, working from the biological data in the Zephyrian message. Sergeant Tony Clark led the ship's Marine complement through intensive combat drills, preparing for ground operations against an unknown enemy. As the Dakota raced toward its destination, Morrison stood alone in his cabin, looking out at the stars. He had made his choice, and now all he could do was hope they would arrive in time to make a difference. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, people were dying. But humanity was coming, and that had to count for something. The USS Dakota dropped out of quantum space at the edge of the Kepler system, and immediately Captain Jake Morrison knew they were too late. The main viewing screen showed a scene of complete devastation. Pieces of destroyed ships floated in the darkness like broken toys scattered by an angry child. "My God," whispered Lieutenant Amy Foster from her position at the communications console. She was scanning the debris field, trying to identify what remained of the Zephyrian defense fleet. "Sir, I'm reading the signatures of at least 30 destroyed vessels. None of them were very large, but they put up a fight." Morrison felt his jaw tighten. The Zephyrians had tried to defend their world with whatever ships they had, but it hadn't been enough. He could see blast patterns on the larger pieces of wreckage that told the story of a one-sided battle. "Lieutenant Commander Johnson, what do we have on sensors?" Morrison asked his tactical officer. Nick Johnson worked quickly at his station, his fingers dancing across the controls. The main screen changed to show a tactical display of the entire system. Red symbols marked the positions of enemy vessels, while the blue dot of the Dakota sat alone at the system's edge. "Sir, I count 17 Vorthan ships in orbit around the planet. 3 of them are massive, probably dreadnoughts. The rest appear to be cruisers and destroyers. They're positioned for orbital bombardment, not fleet combat." Johnson paused, studying his readings more carefully. "Captain, we're outnumbered by at least 20 to 1. Commander Lisa Beck moved to stand beside Morrison's command chair. She kept her voice low so only he could hear. "Jake, this is suicide. We can't fight that many ships and win. Maybe we should try to gather intelligence and report back to Fleet Command." Morrison understood her concern. Beck was his closest advisor and oldest friend among the crew. She had saved his life more times than he could count, and her tactical judgment was usually excellent. But something about the enemy formation gave him hope. "Look at their positioning, Lisa," he said quietly. "They're not expecting trouble. Those ships are arranged for maximum bombardment efficiency, not defense. They think they've already won." On the main screen, the planet Kepler 442b appeared as an orange-red sphere instead of the blue-green world it should have been. Atmospheric. Fires burned across entire continents and thick smoke clouds blocked out most of the surface. The beautiful world described in the Zephyrian distress signal was dying. "Amy, are you picking up any communications from the surface?" Morrison asked. The young communications officer shook her head sadly. "Nothing on standard frequencies, sir. But there might be some very weak transmissions on unusual wavelengths. The Zephyrians use crystal-based technology that operates differently from our systems." Morrison made his decision. "Take us into the shadow of the larger moon. Use all stealth systems and keep us hidden. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with before we make our move." The Dakota moved silently through space, her advanced stealth technology making her nearly invisible to enemy sensors. The ship had been designed for reconnaissance missions in hostile territory, and her crew knew how to operate without being detected. Once hidden behind the moon, Morrison ordered the launch of reconnaissance drones. These small, unmanned vehicles could slip past enemy sensors and gather detailed information about Vorthan operations. Dr. Helen Wright joined the bridge crew to analyze any biological data they might collect. The first drone reports came back 30 minutes later, and they painted a horrific picture. The Vorthans weren't just conquering the planet. They were systematically exterminating every living thing they could find. "Sir," Johnson reported, his voice tight with anger, "the Vorthans have ground forces conducting search and destroy operations in what's left of the cities. They're using some kind of life detection equipment to hunt down survivors in underground shelters." Dr. Wright studied the biological readings on her tablet. "Captain, I'm detecting Zephyrian life signs, but they're very weak and scattered. My best estimate is that fewer than 500 individuals are still alive on the entire planet." Morrison felt sick. An entire civilization was being wiped out while he watched. The Zephyrians had sent their distress call 6 days ago, and In that time, the Vorthons had murdered millions of innocent people. Sergeant Tony Clark entered the bridge, carrying a detailed report from his Marine platoon. The grizzled veteran had fought in more ground campaigns than anyone else on the ship, and his tactical expertise was legendary among the crew. "Captain, I've been studying the drone footage of Vorthon ground operations. Their soldiers are tough and well-equipped, but they're not expecting resistance. They're moving in predictable patterns and using standard search tactics. If we could get a small force on the ground, we might be able to disrupt their operations." "With 12 Marines, against thousands of enemy soldiers?" Beck asked skeptically. Clark smiled grimly. "Ma'am, I've seen smaller forces make a big difference when they had the element of surprise. And these Vorthons have been conducting a slaughter, not a military campaign. They're not prepared for real combat." Morrison studied the tactical display, his mind racing through possibilities. The Dakota couldn't win a direct confrontation with the Vorthon fleet, but maybe she didn't need to. The enemy ships were positioned to support ground operations, not to fight other spacecraft. "What if we didn't try to destroy their fleet?" he asked Johnson. "What if we just disrupted their operations enough to give the survivors a chance?" Johnson understood immediately. "Hit-and-run tactics, sir. Use our superior speed and maneuverability to strike at isolated targets, then disappear before they can respond effectively. We can't win a stand-up fight, but we might be able to even the odds." Amy Foster looked up from her communications station with excitement. "Sir, I'm picking up something. It's very faint, but I think it's a Zephyrian transmission from the surface. They're still alive down there, and they're trying to coordinate their resistance." Morrison felt a spark of hope. The Zephyrians weren't giving up even in the face of extinction. They deserved better than to die alone and forgotten. "Here's what we're going to do," he announced to his crew. "Clark, prepare your Marines for immediate insertion. I want them on the ground within 2 hours, equipped for extended operations behind enemy lines. Their mission is to make contact with Zephyrian survivors and provide whatever assistance they can." "Sir," Beck said carefully, "once we start shooting, there's no going back. The Vorthons will know we're here, and they'll come after us with everything they have." Morrison nodded. "I know. But sometimes you have to take a stand, even when the odds are impossible." Johnson, plot attack vectors on the nearest Vorthon supply ships. "We're going to hit them fast and hard, then disappear before they know what happened." The bridge crew moved with practiced efficiency, preparing for combat against overwhelming odds. In the Marine barracks, Sergeant Clark briefed his soldiers on their upcoming mission. Dr. Wright packed medical supplies designed for alien physiology. Bobby Martinez pushed the ship's engines to maximum performance. As the Dakota prepared for battle, Captain Morrison thought about his grandfather's stories of courage in the face of impossible odds. Sometimes the smallest actions could change the course of history. Sometimes a single ship could make all the difference. On the planet below, Zaraki huddled with her surviving people in the darkness, listening to the approaching footsteps of their executioners. She had no way of knowing that help was finally coming, racing through space toward their desperate situation. The battle for Kepler 442b was about to begin. Zaraki pressed her ear to the tunnel wall, listening to the heavy footsteps above. The Vorthon soldiers were getting closer. Their metal boots crushed the delicate crystal formations that had once decorated the streets of her beautiful city. She could hear their harsh voices speaking in their ugly language, coordinating their search for the last survivors. Behind her, 200 Zephyrians waited in the darkness. These were all that remained of her people on the entire planet. Children clung to their parents, trying not to cry. The elderly whispered final prayers. Even the bravest warriors had given up hope. Then something impossible happened. Her bioscanner began showing new readings. Life forms were approaching from the surface, but they were not Vorthons. These beings were smaller, more compact, and their neural patterns showed high intelligence combined with fierce determination. Zaraki stared at the scanner in confusion. Who else could be on her world? Every other species in this region of space had either been conquered by the Vorthons or had fled to distant systems. Yet the readings were clear. Unknown beings were moving through the ruins above, and they were heading straight for the Vorthon positions. Sergeant Tony Clark moved carefully through the shattered remains of what had once been a beautiful garden. Twisted metal and broken crystal surrounded him on all sides. His squad of 12 Marines followed behind, their weapons ready and their senses alert for danger. The ruins told a story of systematic destruction. The Vorthans had not simply conquered this city. They had tried to erase every trace of the civilization that built it. Ancient statues lay in pieces. Libraries had been burned to ash. Even the trees had been cut down and poisoned. Corporal Kate Sullivan, the squad's medic, carried a pack filled with medical supplies designed for alien biology. Dr. Wright had worked for hours to modify human medicine for Zephyrian physiology, using data from the distress signal. Kate hoped she would get a chance to use it on living patients rather than corpses. Private Ryan Murphy operated a portable scanner that tracked both friendly and enemy movements. His readings showed Vorthon patrol units moving in predictable patterns throughout the ruined city. They were confident and careless, not expecting any resistance. The Marines reached the entrance to the underground tunnel system without being detected. Clark studied his tactical display, looking for the best way to make contact with the survivors. According to the scanner, there were life signs directly below their position. "Murphy, can you tap into their communication system?" Clark asked quietly. The young private worked quickly with his equipment. "I'm getting something, Sergeant. It's not like anything in our databases, but the computer is trying to translate it. These people use some kind of crystal-based technology that we've never seen before." After several minutes, Murphy managed to establish a basic communication link. The first contact between humans and Zephyrians was awkward and confusing, but both species quickly realized they were not enemies. Zaraki felt her heart race when the first translated words appeared on her communication device. The unknown beings identified themselves as humans from a distant star system. They had received her distress signal and had come to help. It seemed impossible, but the evidence was right in front of her. Using hand signals and simple words, Clark explained his mission. His people were soldiers from a ship in orbit. They had come to fight the Vorthans and help any survivors escape. The translation was rough, but the meaning was clear enough. When Zaraki finally met the human soldiers face to face, she was amazed by what she saw. They were shorter than Zephyrians, with solid rather than translucent skin. But their eyes showed the same intelligence and compassion that her people valued. More importantly, they carried advanced weapons and moved with the confidence of experienced warriors. Clark was equally impressed by the Zephyrians. Despite months of terror and loss, they maintained their dignity and grace. Zaraki's telepathic abilities allowed her to coordinate with her people in ways that amazed the human soldiers. When she needed to communicate complex tactical information, she could share it instantly with every Zephyrian in the tunnels. The first joint operation came together quickly. Clark's Marines would provide covering fire and heavy weapons support. The Zephyrians would use their knowledge of local terrain and their telepathic coordination to guide the attack. The target was a Vorthon supply depot that supported their ground operations. Above ground, Captain Morrison began his own impossible mission. The USS Dakota emerged from behind the moon like a ghost, her stealth systems hiding her from enemy sensors until the last possible moment. Her first target was an isolated Vorthon destroyer that had been left to guard a supply convoy. The attack was swift and decisive. The Dakota's plasma cannons tore through the enemy ship's shields before the Vorthans even knew they were under attack. The destroyer exploded in a brilliant flash of light, sending debris spinning through space. On the planet's surface, Clark's Marines and Zaraki's warriors moved through the ruins toward their target. The Vorthon supply depot was heavily guarded, but the defenders were not prepared for a coordinated assault by two different species working together. Private Murphy disabled the depot's sensor array with a precisely placed explosive charge. Corporal Sullivan provided medical support when a young Zephyrian warrior was wounded by enemy fire. The human medicine worked perfectly, healing injuries that would have been fatal without treatment. Clark himself led the final assault on the depot's main building. His plasma rifle cut through Vorthon armor like paper, while Zaraki used her telepathic abilities to coordinate flanking maneuvers that caught the enemy completely off guard. The destruction of the depot was more successful than anyone had dared to hope. Tons of Vorten supplies and equipment went up in flames, seriously disrupting their ground operations. More importantly, the joint human-Zephyrian force had proven that the invaders were not invincible. Word of the successful attack spread quickly, through the underground tunnels. For the first time in months, the Zephyrian survivors felt something other than despair. They had allies now, and those allies knew how to fight. In orbit, Morrison continued his hit-and-run campaign against the Vorthan fleet. The Dakota's superior speed and maneuverability allowed her to strike at isolated targets and disappear before the enemy could respond. One by one, Vorthan supply ships and support vessels found themselves under attack from an enemy they could barely detect. General Krexvor, the Vorthan commander, watched his carefully planned operation falling apart. His ground forces were reporting coordinated attacks by unknown enemies. His fleet was losing ships to a phantom attacker that appeared and disappeared without warning. What should have been a simple extermination was turning into a real war. Back in the tunnels, Zaraki looked at her new human allies with growing hope. These strangers from a distant world had risked everything to answer her people's call for help. They had proven that courage and compassion could still triumph over hatred and cruelty. Clark began training Zephyrian survivors in human military tactics while the telepathic aliens taught his Marines new ways to coordinate their movements. The combination of human technology and Zephyrian mental abilities created a fighting force, unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Dr. Wright's medical breakthrough allowed wounded fighters from both species to recover quickly and return to combat. Her research would eventually become the foundation for universal medical protocols that would save countless lives throughout the galaxy. But the real change was happening in the hearts and minds of both species. Humans and Zephyrians were learning that cooperation between different peoples could create something greater than either could achieve alone. They were writing the first chapter of a new kind of alliance, one based on mutual respect and shared values rather than fear and domination. The battle for Kepler 442b was far from over, but everything had changed. The Vorthans were no longer facing helpless victims. They were fighting an enemy that refused to give up, supported by allies who would never abandon them. Hope had returned to the tunnels beneath the ruined city, carried by 12 human Marines who had traveled across the galaxy to prove that no one fights alone. The news spread across the galaxy faster than anyone expected. A single human ship was fighting the Vorthans and winning. Species that had lived in fear for years suddenly realized that the unstoppable enemy could be stopped after all. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Dakota, watching his tactical display with grim satisfaction. Over the past week, his hit-and-run attacks had destroyed 6 Vorthan ships and seriously damaged 4 others. The enemy fleet that had once seemed invincible was now scattered and defensive. "Sir, we're receiving a priority transmission from the Altarian Federation," reported Lieutenant Amy Foster. Her voice carried a note of excitement that had been missing for days. "They're sending a relief fleet to our position. Estimated arrival time is 18 hours. Morrison felt a surge of hope. The Altarians had been the first major civilization to fall to Vorthon expansion, but they had maintained a government in exile among the outer colonies. If they were willing to fight again, it meant other species might follow their example. Lieutenant Commander Nick Johnson looked up from his weapons console. "Captain, I'm also detecting ships from the Nebula reaches heading this way. I count at least 12 vessels of unknown design. They're not responding to our communications, but they're definitely coming to help." On the planet below, Sergeant Tony Clark led another successful raid against Vorthan ground forces. His Marines and their Zephyrian allies had become expert at striking fast and disappearing before the enemy could respond. The telepathic coordination provided by Zaraki and her people gave them advantages that no human military force had ever experienced. Corporal Kate Sullivan finished treating a wounded Zephyrian warrior, using medical techniques that combined human technology with alien biology. Her patient would be back in action within hours, something that would have been impossible just weeks ago. "Sergeant," called Private Ryan Murphy from his scanner position, "I'm picking up multiple groups of Vorthans converging on our position. Looks like they're finally getting organized." Clark smiled grimly. The enemy was learning to adapt to their tactics, but so were his people. Pass the word to our Zephyrian friends. Time for Plan Charlie. We're going to show these lizards what happens when you mess with people who know how to work together. The battle that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Human Marines used advanced weapons and tactics, while Zephyrian telepaths provided perfect coordination and battlefield awareness. The combination was devastating. Vorthon soldiers who had terrorized entire worlds found themselves outmaneuvered and outfought by a force they couldn't understand. But the real change was happening in space. Ships from a dozen different species were arriving in the Kepler system, drawn by reports of successful resistance against the Vorthons. The crystalline entity sent vessels made of living crystal that could repair themselves in battle. The gas giant nomads contributed ships that could hide in planetary atmospheres and strike without warning. General Krex Vor watched his invasion force crumble around him. Half his fleet was gone, his ground operations were in chaos, and enemy reinforcements were arriving every few hours. The simple extermination mission had become a nightmare of coordinated resistance by species he had never even heard of. In desperation, he activated Protocol Omega, the Vorthon Empire's ultimate weapon. If he could not claim the planet, he would make sure no one else could have it either. The massive dreadnought in the center of his formation began charging its atmospheric incineration beam, a weapon capable of burning away a planet's entire atmosphere. Morrison saw the energy build up on his sensors and understood immediately what was happening. The Vorthons were going to sterilize the entire world rather than admit defeat. Every living thing on Kepler 442b would die unless someone stopped them. All ships, this is Captain Morrison, he broadcast on all frequencies. The enemy is preparing to destroy the planet. We have to stop that dreadnought now, whatever the cost. The response was immediate. Ships from a dozen different species converged on the Vorthon flagship, pouring fire into its shields and armor. But the massive vessel was too well protected, and the atmospheric weapon continued to charge. Morrison made the hardest decision of his life. He ordered all power to the Dakota's shields and positioned his ship directly between the dreadnought and the planet. When the atmospheric beam fired, it struck the human cruiser with the force of a dying star. The Dakota's shields held for exactly 17 seconds before failing completely. The ship's hull began to buckle and burn as the terrible energy tore through her structure. But those 17 seconds were enough. The beam's power was absorbed and dispersed, saving the planet below. Commander Lisa Beck helped Morrison to his feet as emergency alarms rang throughout the ship. Half the bridge stations were dark and smoke filled the air. The Dakota was dying, but she had accomplished her mission. All hands abandon ship, Morrison ordered calmly. It's been an honor serving with you. But even as the Dakota died, her sacrifice was inspiring others to acts of unprecedented courage. The combined fleet of alien species pressed their attack with renewed fury. The Vorthon dreadnought, weakened by firing its ultimate weapon, finally succumbed to the concentrated assault from a dozen different civilizations. General Krex Vor's flagship exploded in a brilliant flash of light that could be seen from the planet's surface. The remaining Vorthon ships, leaderless and demoralized, began to retreat from the system. On Kepler 442b, Zara Key stood in the ruins of her capital city, watching enemy ships flee into the darkness of space. Around her, both human and Zephyrian survivors cheered their victory. But the celebration was mixed with sorrow for the brave humans who had given their lives to save a world they had never seen before. The rescue shuttles from the Allied fleet found most of the Dakota's crew alive in escape pods. Captain Morrison was among the survivors, though his ship was gone forever. When he was brought to the surface, Zara Key was there to greet him personally. The telepathic communication between human and Zephyrian needed no translation. Both species understood loss, sacrifice, and the bonds that form between people who fight together against impossible odds. In the months that followed, the Battle of Kepler 442b became the turning point in galactic history. The Vorthon Empire, which had seemed unstoppable, began to face rebellions on dozens of worlds. Species that had been enemies for centuries joined together to form the Galactic Defense Coalition, united by the example set by one human ship and her crew. The memorial erected in the ruins of the Zephyrian capital was simple but powerful. It bore the names of all those who had died defending the world, both human and alien. But the inscription that meant the most was written in both English and Zephyrian crystal script. Just as all hope was gone, soldiers landed, and everything changed. Dr. Helen Wright's medical research became the foundation for universal healthcare that would serve dozens of species. Sergeant Clark's tactical innovations were studied in military academies across the galaxy. The Dakota's sacrifice inspired an entire generation of spacers to put principle before safety. But perhaps the most important change was in the hearts and minds of every species that had witnessed humanity's response to the Zephyrian distress call. They had learned that sometimes the smallest acts of courage could change the fate of entire civilizations. The galaxy was a different place now. Where once there had been fear and isolation, there was hope and cooperation. Where once the strong had preyed upon the weak, there were protectors willing to stand up for those who could not protect themselves. It had all started with a simple decision by one human captain who believed that no one should die alone and forgotten in the darkness. That decision had lit a flame that would burn across the stars for generations to come.